So I don't know if you guys saw, but Trump reportedly called Milwaukee a, quote, horrible city to a room full of Republicans. And this is wild because this is where the Republican National Convention is going to take place next month. The Trump campaign denied that he called it that, but this is definitely a hot take to trash a city you're about to visit, right? So I don't know. I'm thinking of other hot takes about cities, but I want to go positive. So I wanted to ask you both, what is an underrated city that you would defend to the death?
Ooh.
That's a really good question. I was just gearing up to bash Wisconsin, and then you threw a curveball at me.
Is this a Minnesota thing?
Yes, I know. I have a lot of friends from Wisconsin. I'm from Minnesota. I have a lot of friends from Wisconsin. They're lovely people. They just come from a regrettable place.
Some of my best friends are from Wisconsin. Welcome to the Campaign Moment on this Friday, June 14th. I'm Elahe Izadi, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior politics reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're also joined this week by the Post's White House bureau chief, Toluse Olorunnipa. Hey, Tolu.
Hello. It's good to be here.
Tolu, I know that you were just in France covering President Biden's visit, commemorating the 80th anniversary of D-Day, which, I don't know, that seems like a pretty somber occasion, but was there a campaign element to this trip?
Well, the whole thing, sort of the subtext of everything was the campaign, the contrast between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. President Biden did not mention Trump's name at all during this trip, but you could see in the places that he went to visit, in the things that he was talking about, that he was trying to draw a contrast on the global stage between himself and Donald Trump. He even went to a cemetery, a famous cemetery that has become infamous because Donald Trump refused to go there back in 2018. And the story that eventually came out was that Trump had called the people, the American service members that were buried there, suckers and losers, and wondered why anyone would go and fight for the United States. And so that became a major controversy towards the end of Trump's administration, and it has dogged him for several years. And so in a little bit of trolling, presidential trolling and campaign trolling, President Biden, as the last thing that he did in France, was go to the cemetery and talk about how it's important to, quote unquote, show up.
America showed up. America showed up to stop the Germans. America showed up to make sure that they did not prevail. And America shows up when we need it, just like our allies show for us.
You've criticized President Trump for not coming here on his trip. What message are you hoping to send to voters by being here right now?
Any other questions?
Even without mentioning Trump's name, he was thinking about Trump and thinking about how to draw a contrast with his chief political rival while he was in France.
Yeah, this idea of the Biden campaign trying to remind voters of the Trump presidency is something that I'm personally very fascinated by. And Aaron, I do want to ask you, what is the big campaign story that you've been following this week?
Yeah, I think this week we started to get some really interesting results in congressional elections, primaries, and then a special election in Ohio. And of course, we saw for the second time in 2 weeks this week, somebody who has at least some tie to the 2024 campaign be convicted of a crime in Hunter Biden.
Yeah, I actually do want to start the conversation about the conclusion of Hunter Biden's criminal trial. We're also going to get to another topic later in the show about why you, faithful political podcast listener, are not the type of voter who is going to decide the 2024 presidential race. But to start, as you mentioned, Aaron, on Tuesday, a Delaware jury convicted President Biden's son, Hunter Biden, on 3 felony gun charges. So basically, they found Hunter Biden guilty of lying on paperwork when he bought a firearm. And what he was lying about, prosecutors said, was abusing illegal drugs at the time he signed that paperwork, and therefore he was unlawfully possessing that gun. Okay, so that's what the case is about. But I'm curious to get both of your thoughts on whether this verdict is damaging to the Biden campaign. Tolu?
Well, you have to separate the political from the personal. Is it a political damage for President Biden and his team? Maybe not so much. I mean, first of all, Hunter Biden is not running for anything. The crimes that he's being charged with have really nothing to do with his father. It's very far removed from President Biden, the candidate. And so other than President Biden wanting to show support for his son, it's not clear that it's going to have a political impact in any kind of major way, especially since it has to do with things like addiction and family trauma that a lot of people can actually relate to. I don't see this as a major drag on the Biden ticket. Now, when it comes to the personal impact, President Biden is very emotionally connected with his family, very emotionally impacted by what's happening with his son, by the fact that his son is in the public spotlight in part because he is president. And people around President Biden are very concerned that the fact that Hunter Biden has now been convicted of these charges, may end up being sentenced to jail, and has additional charges that he's facing in September for tax evasion. This is going to weigh on President Biden personally, and people around him are worried about how that could have an impact on his ability to campaign, his ability to make the case against Donald Trump in the political sphere.
So, Tolu, that makes sense to me that there is an impact on a personal level. I guess I still don't quite understand why there's no political ramifications. I get what you're saying, that Hunter Biden is not, a politician running for office, but isn't Hunter Biden the person that Republicans have been using as a proxy to attack Joe Biden? Because aren't there other things that Hunter Biden is accused of doing that has become a big line of political attack?
For sure. And we will continue to hear the words Hunter Biden coming from Republicans for the next several months before the election. But this specific case, this gun case, is one that you haven't really heard a lot of Republicans use to attack Hunter Biden, in part because the pro-gun Second Amendment wing of the Republican Party isn't fully comfortable with the idea that people should be prosecuted for how they fill out a form when they're trying to use their Second Amendment rights to buy a gun. And so there are questions about whether or not this law should have even been used to prosecute someone. And, people who support gun rights don't like the idea of the federal government finding ways to charge people who are trying to gain access to guns. And so that is one reason this case is not as politically damaging, because Republicans aren't really going after Hunter Biden over it. And also because there's not really a nexus to Joe Biden in this case. The other case happens to be a case having to do with business dealings, taxes, how much money Hunter was bringing in between the years of 2016 and 2019 when, he's being charged with evading his taxes, a time that coincides with Joe Biden's vice presidency, the end of his vice presidency, his post-vice presidency period. And this is a period of time that Republicans were looking at and trying to draw a line between Hunter Biden and the millions of dollars he was bringing in and tried to allege that that money was corrupt and it had something to do with Joe Biden and that Joe Biden was in on the take and receiving some of these funds. And so I think that case will involve more political maneuvering by Republicans trying to draw a connection between Hunter Biden and the money that he was making, the taxes that he was allegedly not paying, and Joe Biden, the candidate.
I think all that's right. One thing that's been really interesting for me is the Republican reaction to this. I think it was Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky basically made the argument that if we're going to start bringing these charges, then there's millions of people who have guns and maybe are marijuana users who could be, felons at this point. I also think it's an acknowledgement. The reaction to this from the right has not been cheering the verdict so much as arguing, based upon very little evidence, I would add, that this is some kind of a smokescreen, that this was a case that was brought against Hunter Biden to, avoid bringing charges on much more serious things like the foreign business dealings that he had. I think it's also worth mentioning that, as Tolu said, these are lines of inquiry that Republicans have gone after for years and haven't been able to connect to President Biden himself. But that's been really what they hoped this whole process would lead to one day, that they could really more directly tie it to President Biden. And what we see in polling, even of just Hunter Biden's broader legal problems, not specifically focused on this prosecution, is that a lot of people see something unsavory in what Hunter Biden has done. As many as half of people think that his foreign business dealings, for instance, are bad. But most people don't connect that to President Biden. It's about 4 in 10. Again, we're talking about kind of the most true believers in the Republican Party base. And so Republicans haven't been able to make that connection. They didn't see this as potentially allowing them to do so. And so we saw a very interesting reaction from them where they kind of didn't really celebrate this verdict.
Another piece of the puzzle here is Republicans have been trying to make the case that the fact that Donald Trump has been convicted and now is a convicted felon is a sign that the Justice Department is weaponized against Republicans, weaponized against the leading Republican candidate for president. This sort of makes it harder for them to make that case because the son of the sitting president was prosecuted by the same Justice Department and found guilty. And so that is another reason why this case and this prosecution coming right on the heels of Donald Trump's conviction has less political salience than one might think for a situation that happens to be historic and the first example of a child of a president being convicted of a felony.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me hearing you both talk about it, that if this was actually a potent political attack, Republicans would have taken it, and they haven't for all the reasons you've laid out. I'm just even wondering historically, does the behavior of a president's children ever really have an impact on the politics of the presidency?
Yeah, I think the most recent analog that we might have to something like this is Roger Clinton, Bill Clinton's younger half-brother, who was occasionally an issue during his presidency. Of course, Bill Clinton, on his way out of office, pardoned Roger Clinton for an old drug charge from the 1980s. And so, I think that we didn't really get a sense that damaged Bill Clinton. I think maybe the better comparison is Billy Carter, the brother of Jimmy Carter, who had there was some controversy late in Carter's presidency about Billy Carter's work with the Libyan government and whether that was something that was an acceptable thing. There's a little bit of a comparison there because of Hunter Biden's overseas work and questions about that. But this is also something that the American people didn't seem to hold against Jimmy Carter himself. They said that President Carter hadn't done anything wrong by 67-17 in a poll late in the 1980 election. Again, they saw this as something that was unsavory and they didn't like what Billy Carter had done, but they did not connect it to President Carter, which I think is what's happening right now with Hunter Biden and Joe Biden.
Yeah, maybe it's just this feeling that people have when they hear a story like that, like, well, we all have family members. We're not them.
Exactly,
Everyone's got some drama in their family, but I do appreciate your encyclopedic knowledge of presidential family drama, Aaron. So, we also talk so much about Biden and Trump, obviously. I mean, that's the big race this year, but it can be easy to overlook other races that are not at the top of the ticket. And Aaron, actually, this week you wrote about a race in Ohio's 6th congressional district. Tell me about this district and why it stood out to you as important or interesting.
Yeah, this is a really interesting race. I'm somebody who likes to watch these special elections and, off-year elections because they give us a little bit more sense of how people are actually voting. We rely on the polls a lot, but you don't know if you're getting the sample right. And this is actually a race where it's a Republican versus a Democrat. It's a district that Donald Trump carried by 29 points in the 2020 election, but the Democrat came within 10 points of the Republican in this race, so a lot closer than usual. There was a time actually on Tuesday night where it looked like it might be even closer than that. So a really big overperformance for Democrats. And that's something that they've been doing a lot in recent years, particularly after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. We've seen them improve on President Biden's numbers in the 2020 election in these races. So they'll do a few points better, or in this case, 19 points better. And that seems significant, that these are people actually turning out to vote. I think there are a couple of reasons to be skeptical this means too much. The turnout in this race was very low. There were only about 60,000 people who turned out. That's 1/3 of how many voted in the recent New York special election for Congress. And also, it's a somewhat unusual district. So while this is a 29-point Trump district, the current construction of it would actually have voted for Barack Obama in 2008. That seems really kind of ridiculous, like the idea that it could have swung that much. But it's actually the one district in this country that has moved the most towards Republicans in the Trump era. So it's a little unusual. It's hard to draw too many lessons from one district and try to overlay that on the broader country. But I think the big takeaway is that this is just the latest race in which Democrats have been overperforming what you'd expect them to, even as they're kind of freaking out about all these 2024 polls.
Tolu, just hearing that, I'm wondering from your perspective covering the Biden White House and following President Biden, are they paying close attention to these sort of indicators on the ground that, okay, yeah, there are these national polls or even polls of swing states that don't look that great for the president right now, but are they looking to places like this and seeing indications that, oh, well, maybe actually when it comes to Election Day and the days leading up to for early voting, that things might break in our favor in a way and people are underestimating us?
Absolutely. The Biden campaign, the people who are supporting President Biden, they love special elections. They point to them all the time. They say that special elections are the best example of people actually voting. They take every win, every ballot initiative that's happened since the fall of Roe v. Wade, every special election where the Democrats have overperformed, and said that is the best example of why the polls don't necessarily matter. The polls don't necessarily reflect what's happening, that people are voting and they're voting for Democrats. They're voting for the Biden agenda. Sometimes they overinterpret some of these things, but they love the fact that there are all of these data points and all of these special elections and ballot initiatives that have happened over the past couple of years where Democrats have overperformed. They've done better than even Biden had done in 2020, and they've done better than expected and better than what the polls called for. And so they are saying that that is why President Biden is going to outperform the polls, and that is why President Biden is going to win in 2024. That is their best example. That's something they call upon over and over and over again, and they watch the numbers very closely. So I wouldn't be surprised if you hear more from Democrats about the special elections and hear that they say that that is why that they are confident that they're going to do well in November.
Tolu, I heard a siren in the background as you were talking, and it sort of made me think like, should they be coming to all those conclusions based on special elections and dismissing the poll numbers? Like, is anyone in the campaign like, no?
Bad spin alert. Bad spin alert. No, I think one point that I'd add on top of this is, and I think it's hard to say this is not a good thing for Democrats. If you're having elections, you want to do well in elections. These elections are happening. Democrats are doing well in them. The flip side of that is that Donald Trump's base and the Republican Party more broadly has in recent years become much more reliant on less frequent voters, people who don't always show up to midterm elections or these special elections. But it could be different when Donald Trump is actually on the ballot. Like, is this party just so defined by Donald Trump that these people can't get excited about something unless it's actually him? And I think there's something to that. We don't know exactly how that's going to pan out, but that's a very kind of undersold factor in all of this. And I think should give Democrats a little bit of pause in reading too much into these results.
If not, we'll just replay that siren over and over.
There we go, yeah.
Okay, this is a great moment to just take a quick break. And when we come back, let's talk about how, I'm sorry to say, faithful podcast listeners, politics podcast listeners are probably not the type of voter who will decide the 2024 presidential race. We'll be right back. So this next conversation topic actually came from your newsletter, Aaron, which is also called The Campaign Moment. It's great. Everyone should subscribe. And you wrote about just how disconnected most Americans are from the campaign news cycle, which is what we talk about every week here. What does the polling you looked at say about whether likely voters know what's even going on?
Yeah, this is something that I've been thinking about for a while, and then I was really struck by a survey that I saw this week. It was from Yahoo News and YouGov, and it asked some very basic questions about Donald Trump's indictments. The question was actually, has Donald Trump been indicted for this? And it listed the things that are the subjects of his indictments, and a lot of people were not familiar, or at least said that they were not familiar with the fact that Trump had been indicted for trying to overturn the election, for having and withholding classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. It was only about half of people who said affirmatively that he had been indicted for these things, and they knew it. There were about 1 in 5 Americans said the opposite, said that he had not been indicted for these things. And it struck me as really interesting and kind of a window into this question of like, how much are people who are not listening to this podcast, are not reading the Campaign Moment newsletter, are not necessarily reading the Washington Post, although I know that's not too many people out there. How much are they actually kind of digesting the conviction in Manhattan and things like that. And there's a lot of other indicators that suggest that they're not really. The same poll showed only 1 in 5 voters, were familiar that Trump was guilty in this case. 2 out of every 5 registered voters under the age of 30 did not know about the verdict. A majority of independents have said in the past that they knew a little or nothing at all about the classified documents indictment. There was a poll in May that showed just 1 in 5 voters were familiar with Trump having talked about overturning the Constitution. These are things that we're all well familiar with because this is our job, and our listeners are probably familiar with them because they listen to this and they read our stuff. But I think we shouldn't overestimate the idea that there are lots of voters out there who just don't have any frame of reference for any of this stuff right now. Whether they'll ultimately get that ahead of the November election, or they'll just vote accordingly without, having any knowledge of these things, that's quite possible. But there are a lot of things that I think are looming here that people haven't really reckoned with, and that can cause shifts that we really haven't seen so far in the polls.
And we should also say we welcome any and all listeners to the podcast. If you don't know anything of what Aaron just said, you are welcome here. We welcome you to come listen to this.
That's the listener that I want most of all. We want all those people.
Tolu, I'm wondering how this is intersecting with the pitch President Biden is trying to make to the American people on the campaign trail. How much of, Trump's trials and tribulations, literal trials and tribulations, are factoring into his message, and how much he's banking on people tuning into the campaign, and particularly from the Biden perspective, the baggage that Trump has.
They absolutely need people to tune in. They need people who are infrequent voters, people who are part of the Democratic base who may have tuned out after Biden got elected, maybe people who were spending a lot of time looking at the news during the Trump years because everything was an outrage and there was so much drama around the former president. And then once Biden got elected, a lot of those people went back to their normal lives. They went back to the things that normally entertain them, and, they stopped paying attention to politics. And for a lot of those people, it's not as clear to them what Biden has accomplished over the past 3.5 years. And Biden needs them to tune in, one, to give him credit for the things that he's actually done, because, he does have a pretty extensive record legislatively and in terms of the things that he's accomplished on his list of promises that he made in 2020. And at the same time, he needs them to tune in and realize that Donald Trump is still a force. He's still the same person that caused a lot of people to turn out to vote in 2020 because they were outraged by his presidency, caused a lot of people to turn out in 2018 and become active after he was elected in 2016 because they were outraged by the things that he was doing early in his presidency. A lot of those people aren't as outraged. A lot of the things that Trump says now doesn't create the same kind of breaking news siren that they used to. And Biden needs to remind people of what Trump has done in the past and also convince them, in the words of a lot of his aides, that he would be worse the second time, that he would be an even worse, even more extreme, even more outrageous force in American politics than he was for 4 years between 2017 and 2021. And so that message hasn't yet really sunk in for a lot of voters. And the Biden campaign is hoping that more people will tune in and listen to that message and be activated by that message. And even if they don't love Joe Biden, even if they think he's too old, even if they don't think he's delivered as many of the promises as he should have, they would vote for him based on a fear of Donald Trump and what he would do in a second term. And if those people stay tuned out, then that could be very detrimental to Biden's campaign.
Tolu, it reminds me of the story that you shared at the top of the episode of the almost like campaign trolling of showing up at the cemetery and trying to, remind people not so subtly, hey, do you remember when Donald Trump reportedly said this wild thing? And we've talked about this term on the show before, Trump amnesia. So I'm wondering, how normal actually is this? Like, how much does this have to do with Trump, this idea of people forgetting what this presidency was like, and how much of this is just people have just stopped paying attention and they're not paying attention right now because we're still 5 months out from the election? Have voters always just been this disconnected from the news at this point?
It is something that is a big challenge for the Biden campaign. They're trying to figure out how to remind people of what happened during the Trump years. People have, and we've seen this in polling, people have these nostalgic views of what it was like to live under Trump. They think about the economy being stronger. They think about prices being lower. They think about there being less drama on the world stage. And to some extent, some of those things are true, but people have forgotten a lot of the drama that Trump caused, a lot of the problems that he had to deal with while he was president. And that's human nature. You know, when things fade into the past, you forget them. And all presidents, it seems, have sort of this nostalgic period after they leave office where their poll numbers increase.
George W. Bush, the painter, right?
for sure.
Yeah, George W. Bush is a great example of that. He was at about 25% approval shortly before he left office because of the Iraq War, because of Hurricane Katrina. Now he's someone who 6 in 10 Americans like. It is something that happens. Retrospective approval is what it's called. And Gallup measures these numbers for all former presidents. And pretty much every president going back to John F. Kennedy got more popular after leaving office. There is a difference with Trump, though, of course, because he is still so ever present in our lives. He's running for a second term. He hasn't really faded so much, and we had January 6th hearings and things like that. So I think Democrats are apoplectic that people's views of Trump have still improved, even though they've had all of that information available to them to remind them about those things.
But Aaron, I wonder, though, how much do Democrats bear the blame here of, okay, you can be so upset that people are feeling much better about Trump than they did before, but have you given them an alternative that satisfies them? Like, is it enough to just turn out to vote against someone rather than for someone?
Well, Democrats like to blame you and I for that. So they say the media is not.
Oh, I thought you meant you and me specifically.
No, not you specifically, at least as far as I know. I haven't seen that.
Yeah, I haven't checked my Twitter feed yet.
There is something to be said for, as Tolu mentioned, kind of like the Donald Trump show being old news at this point. And I think, potentially you could say the media, should write about these things as if they're new because he's a candidate now. But I think there is some of this that it's the voters tuning it out too. The voters have been through so many of these controversies that maybe they're just not as interested in these things anymore. And it makes it harder to drive that message. I don't think that I've seen the Biden campaign really hone in on what they're going to do with this. I think it makes sense in certain ways to hold that for a little bit later in the election so you don't have to sustain that message over the course of 4 or 5 months. And I think that could have an impact on the race. But the improved views of Trump and his presidency are a huge factor in this race. And if the Biden campaign can't do something about that, it's going to be a huge roadblock in them trying to win a second term.
As an aside, I just love the idea that people find this election boring when you have one candidate who is a convicted felon and another candidate whose son was also just convicted. Those are both historic things. And on paper, you could say, you can make the argument, has there ever been a more interesting election in modern history? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's not boring. I think it's familiar. And I think people just lost their ability to pay attention to the blow by blow constantly. And I think that's, I don't know how calculated this is from Donald Trump, but he will repeat things over and over again. He will push the envelope constantly in ways that kind of wear you down. And I think that's in certain ways what's happened with the American people.
And I wonder, Aaron, like looking at that phenomenon in the polling you've written about, do you think that benefits Trump more or Biden more? The fact that people aren't paying as much attention, the fact that people are seeing this as familiar and maybe not as energetic or enthusiastic about voting in 2024 than they've been in the past?
I think if you look at the specific things where we have data on this, it accrues to Trump's benefit. So there was a survey last week of the economy that showed like majorities of Americans think we're in a recession and that unemployment is at a 50-year high.
Both things are not true.
Both things are very far from true. Inflation is a very real thing, but those things are not negative marks against Biden's economy right now. And so some of that is partisanship. Some of that's just Republicans responding to a pollster and saying, yeah, of course the economy is terrible. Biden's president. But some of it is just not engaging with the way things are. The same thing is true of Trump's indictments. We have Republicans saying things in these polls about the objective substance of these cases that's simply not true. And to the extent that Republicans actually don't believe those things or don't think those very objective things are true, that gives them a permission structure to stand by Trump, even though he's a convicted felon. And so I think the kind of low information aspect of our electorate right now is certainly something that accrues to Trump's benefit.
Well, so looking ahead to next week, Tolu, what will you be paying attention to?
every week feels like a year
A
in
fresh
terms
start?
of the amount of news.
Like a fresh start?
That's a positive way of looking at things. I'm first looking at this weekend. Joe Biden will be going to Los Angeles, where he's going to be holding another glitzy fundraiser with the likes of George Clooney, Julia Roberts, Jimmy Kimmel's going to be there. They did something similar in New York back in March, where they raised $25 million and they had, a star-studded cast and performers, and they had tons of people come out. It's a new model for Biden, who doesn't necessarily have the sort of star power of an Obama or even a Hillary Clinton, but he's been able to raise a lot of money by surrounding himself with sort of up-and-coming group of stars and performers and people that could be more of a draw. And so I'll be looking very closely at how that plays out. And then during the week, Joe Biden will be preparing for the debate. So I'll be paying close attention to how he does that.
The debate, it's coming up. Aaron, what are you looking forward to next week?
I'm going to take a page out of our colleague Isaac Arnstorff's book here and say I'm looking forward to the beach and margaritas because I am out next week. But the week after that, the debate is going to be huge.
So we'll have to all go to this undisclosed city that you're going to, where you're going to go to the beach and have margaritas.
I'm not going to Wisconsin, I'll tell you that much.
The Wisconsin hate on this show. I love Wisconsin, for the record. Go Badgers.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I don't want to lose any listeners. Wisconsin is great.
We are a big tent here at the campaign moment. Yeah. Well, that's it for today's episode. Thank you, Tolu.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Aaron.
Thank you. And don't forget to subscribe to the Campaign Moment newsletter.
Yeah, you can find a link to Aaron's great newsletter. It's called The Campaign Moment, and a link to that will be in our show notes at postreports.com. Toluse Olorunnipa is the White House bureau chief for The Post, and Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter. That's it for this week on The Campaign Moment. If you're tuning in via Post Reports, we're going to keep bringing you these conversations most Fridays. But you'll be able to hear more from Aaron and our other colleagues by also following the Campaign Moment show feed itself. This is where we'll be dropping other episodes as campaign news picks up. We had one actually this week on the fierce competition to be Donald Trump's running mate. So be sure to look up the Campaign Moment podcast wherever you are listening. Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and Ted Muldoon. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy. Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Monica Campbell, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Rennie Sranovsky, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Trinity Webster Bass, Allison Michaels, Renita Jablonski, and Martine Powers. I'm Elahe Izadi. Have a great weekend. This is like the meanest I've ever heard Aaron. This is so funny to me. Okay, well, Tolu, which state do you hate? Now I want to know.
What's it? I don't know. There's a state that I always found that people from New Jersey were very mean when I was like younger, and I think maybe that was like my southern
sensibilities were offended.
Yeah, when I first got into the workforce and started meeting people from New Jersey, I was like, why are you all so mean?
Oh my God, this is so funny.